Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Chris Hislop. I'm the executive director of the Montana World Affairs Council. And for those of you who don't know who we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We work across the state in schools and communities, and we're dedicated to facilitating understanding on the world and international events in schools and communities across Montana. And that's what we do. And we do programs like this, which are for a person like me, who's a kind of international affairs geek, and an amazing opportunity to learn more about the world. Now, I'm going to introduce our guests here very shortly, but I wanted to say a quick word about what's been going on in the past kind of 36 hours. Dr. Heather Ashby, whom I'll introduce, has arrived from Washington, D.C., and we've been on a whirlwind tour of several Montana high schools. Big part of what we do is programs like this with the community, but an even bigger part of what we do is working in high schools across the state to bring the world into classrooms, to help students understand what is going on, but more importantly, why does it matter? What effect does something like the situation in Ukraine have on them, their friends, their families, their communities, their state, and their nation? That's not something you often get on CNN or Fox News. And then beyond that, we try to help kids also understand, if you know what's happening and how it affects you, what can you do about it? What can you do? What can your civic leaders do? What can your community do about these things? So we try to help students understand that. And Dr. Ashby, and then today, Ambassador Lofits and I were in Drummond and in Phillipsburg on the way here. And I have to say, of all of the kind of incredibly cool things I get to do in my job, this is one of the coolest, because young people are so interested and so engaged and want to know more. I wish you all could have been there with us today in Phillipsburg, where these kids were absolutely amazed. And that school, the entire school, showed up for our presentation, as they did last spring when we webcast. We had a webcast with two teenage Ukrainian, I would call them kids, but they're more like young adults, who spoke living 2 miles south of Kyiv and living in the war. And in fact, during the webcast, there was a moment when they said that the air raid sirens have gone off, we have to pause. And so these are the kinds of things we're trying to bring to Montana and Montanans. And also not just because Ukraine might be the issue of the day, but because it matters. It matters to Montana, it matters to Montanans. And we're going to get a little better idea of why that matters with our expert speakers. So I will, after we hear from our speakers, we will have a very ample time for questions and answers and a discussion. I'll come back and talk to you a little bit then about how that goes. So as you listen, you might want to be thinking of some questions, some thoughts that you'd like to share. Before I go on, I want to welcome a very special guest who's with us tonight. Bogdan, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but Kelechavi, am I close? Bogdan Kelechavi is here. Bogdan is here as a guest of the Ukraine relief effort, and some of our friends here from the Ukraine relief effort are right here. This is thank you very much for coming. This is a nationwide relief effort in support of the Ukrainian people who are affected by the war. And those of you who'd like to learn more about what's going on here in Bozeman and around the world, you're welcome to speak to these good people afterwards. I'll be around. But just to tell you that, Bogdan is a mayor, and he and his dedicated team, which includes his wife, who unfortunately couldn't be with us in Bozeman, have been working tirelessly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine to meet the needs of its citizens and residents. So he's here with us tonight. Bogdan, special thanks to you for coming. Sincere thank you. And with that, I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers. Dr. Heather Ashby is the Senior Program Officer for the Center for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Dr. Ashby joined USIP after 7 years with the Department of Homeland Security. where she worked at the intersection of Homeland Security and International Affairs. She also focused on U.S.-Russian relations. Her research interests include Russia's activities in the global south, particularly in Africa. Dr. Ashby researches and publishes on Russia's involvement in conflict zones and efforts to wield influence in the global south. She also supports USIP's work on Ukraine and strategic competition. Dr. Ashby received her doctorate from the University of Southern California. Joining Dr. Ashby is our very own Ambassador Bob Loftis. Ambassador Loftis served in the State Department and Foreign Service from 1980 to 2012, where he held a wide variety of assignments, including acting coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, special representative for avian and pandemic influenza, senior advisor for security negotiations and agreements, ambassador to Lesotho, and deputy chief of mission in Mozambique. He was most recently an interagency professional in residence at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador Loftis served as the Deputy Commandant and Senior Advisor for International Affairs at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at the National Defense University, where he also taught strategic leadership. In early 2008, Ambassador Loftis was the lead negotiator for a status of forces agreement with Iraq. He was also the Deputy Executive Director of the Implementation Planning Team for the creation of the Department of Defense's new African Command, known as AFRICOM. Previously, his overseas assignments included the U.S. mission at the United Nations in Geneva and U.S. embassies in New Zealand, Brazil, and Guinea-Bissau. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests. Yeah, go ahead.
So over the last several days, in a radio program last week, Heather and I have developed a little rapport where we speak for a few minutes and then we open it up for questions. Neither one of us are going to have really long remarks, but we found that it's a lot better to have this interaction rather than have us make some really lengthy, long comments to put people to sleep. So I'm going to ask you to start as we have before. Maybe you want to do what you've done with explaining USIP and then sort of some initial observations.
Oh. All right, really happy to be here. It's sad that my road trip for Chris is coming to an end. We started in Missoula and we worked our way across to Bozeman. And so delighted that people showed up tonight. And so as Chris noted, I'm a senior program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And the U.S. Institute of Peace doesn't get a lot of attention, which it should, and hopefully with a lot of initiatives we're working on to increase more attention on the organization across the U.S. And so the U.S. Institute of Peace was founded around 40 years ago under the Reagan administration in a very different conflict environment. And so it was during the Cold War with a more intense focus on looking at strategic stability, another name for working on nuclear arms control. And over time, over the decades, we have noticed how conflict has evolved. It's not just what we in Washington call kinetic activity, which is military to military. Conflict also involves disinformation, various types of propaganda, cyber war, attacks on critical infrastructure. And so at the U.S. Institute of Peace, my Center for Russia and Europe is looking at those kinetic forms of conflict, but also the way conflict is evolving and trying to get ahead of what we can do to help further peace and security for U.S. national security and foreign policy, but also for the world and interacting with governments, local organizations, civil society. So within the Center for Russia and Europe, we have three main lines of effort. The first one is focusing on nuclear arms. Previously, we did engagement with the Russians to maintain that sort of strategic stability in that particular area and to monitor and to make sure that there's no development of more high-tech nuclear weapons or other forms of dangerous weapon systems. Is it difficult to hear me? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Carl is up there in the booth sorting this out. Let's try.
All right,
How's the sound here, audience? Can you speak at it?
yeah, is that working?
We'll call a little feedback. It's coming through. You gotta hit the rhythm again, maybe. What did you do, Chris? Once in one night, you never know what's happening. Okay, now it's muted.
All right, is that better?
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So our first line of effort is looking at nuclear arms, maintaining that type of stability in our relations with Russia, but also expanding to look at China as well, which is in adhering to the same type of treaties. We don't have that dynamic with China yet. The second line of effort is looking at Russia's activities in various conflict zones in the world, focused on Africa, such as Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, and then it's also looking at Latin America, Russia's support for growing authoritarian systems, such as in Venezuela and Nicaragua. And then lastly, our third line of effort focuses on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as looking at the implications for European security and transatlantic relationships between the US and European partners. And so I don't want to take up too much more time. I'm just going to talk about what's been developed in the past 24 hours. And just coming down here with Chris, I was reading Telegram channels in Russian and noting that there are protests across the country against the mobilization. And so there are arrests coming, there are people out there in numerous cities, big and smaller cities, protesting the mobilization that Putin announced. So Putin announced earlier, before those protests happened, and before Biden gave his speech at UNGA, which I think was strategic as well, that there was going to be a partial mobilization of people with military experience, reservists in the Russian Federation. And so they are outlining quotas that each region has to adhere to in order to call up those reservists with military experience. The other aspect of what his speech outlined was talking about escalated the rhetoric about what type of weapons he's going to use in Ukraine. And so that's been some of the latest developments in that particular area. I don't anticipate that the mobilization is going to go too well. Just within hours of the speech, to have people out there protesting is a strong sign that it will not turn out well, in addition to the other issues that the Russian military is encountering, lack of equipment and resources for their military, of course, their failure, and the success of the Ukraine counteroffensive, which has been a big success and is leading to this crisis within Russia about how to respond.
Thanks. If I can sort of make some more general comments, there's a really good book that I recommend everybody have a chance to read. And I actually would have recommended it to Vladimir Putin before he started this war. And it's called Every War Must End. And basically the premise is that countries are really good at starting wars. They're really good at fighting wars. And they're really bad at figuring out how to get out of wars, especially when the cost rises to a level that whatever gain that you thought you were going to get, the cost has become too high. And I think that's what we're beginning to see with Russia's actions in Ukraine. I would not begin to say that this war is close to over, unfortunately. I think we're going to be looking in for a long, hard slog. But there's also a little bit of an irony here also that there is a remark attributed to the Minister of the Interior of Russia in 1905, where he said, what this country needs is a short, victorious war to stem the tide of revolution. And then the Russians launched their war against Japan, where they were essentially crushed, and the revolution really began to take hold after that, culminating in 1917. And so I think, Vladimir Putin had certain aims when he went into Ukraine. One was to crush an independent Ukraine. One was to expand its territory. One was to split NATO and Europe apart and to split Europe from the United States, and to expand Russian influence more generally. Kind of look across the board, he's failed on every single one of those counts. NATO is stronger than it's been in the last 40 years, certainly than I can remember in my career. It's expanding with new members that actually bring a lot of resources and capabilities to the alliance. The Europeans are spending far more on defense than they were before. They're increasing their capabilities. They're talking about accelerating potentially Ukraine's accession to the EU. China is expanding its foothold into Central Asia, and the Europeans are planning to wean themselves away from Russian energy. I don't see a lot of upsides for the Russians out of this. Unfortunately, I don't see also a graceful way for Vladimir Putin to back out of where we're going on this. So there's a lot of very positive news coming out of Ukraine over the last several weeks, but I still think there's a lot of danger ahead for everybody. And unfortunately for Ukraine, I think they're still for a long, hard slog to get the Russians out of their country.
Oh, yeah, I pushed the red button again. So thank you very much for your remarks. As promised, now we've got a very ample period here for Q&A. And I always ask respectfully the same three things in all of our events. And that is when we come to this point for your questions, you're very welcome. It's open forum, open to the public. I would ask that number one, your questions be simply on point. Tonight's discussion is about the situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And I kindly ask you to keep your questions, to that theme. The second is to keep your questions and your comments respectful and constructive. This is how we are in Montana. This is how we work at the Montana World Affairs Council. And I thank you for keeping things respectful. And the third is that questions are an interrogative that ends in a question mark. While I do sincerely appreciate interesting opinions, I don't mean that enthusiastic. It's great to hear your opinion, but my point is that we typically never have enough time to get everybody's question out there. Everybody has interesting questions and things that they want to know. So I would ask you to really not offer a lot of preamble prior to your question. If you could come straight to the point. For the extra long-winded, you will hear me pipe in and say, thank you very much. Your question is. I don't mean that in disrespect, but I mean it just to simply allow others to have a chance to ask a question. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a microphone here tonight. The museum's microphone is not working. So I'll ask you to raise your voice a bit. And then maybe Bob and Heather, if you might kind of just repeat the question or kind of, put it back so everybody has a chance to hear. And we've got plenty of time, so I'm going to stop. And what I'll do is, I'll kind of be standing here. I'll kind of point to you. That tends to work best. I see a gentleman in the back row to you.
Yeah, I got a question. First, just a quick point of clarification. The protesting that you're talking about is occurring within Russia, not Ukraine, correct?
Yes, did I say Ukraine?
Yeah.
Yeah, apologies, it's in Russia.
Yeah. So my question is, how can we, in the future, deal with these countries, or in this case, a dictator that has these nuclear weapons, and at every step, he threatens to use these weapons, and things don't go this way. How can we deal with this sort of thing in the future?
You did work at the UN. You were at
Actually, this has been one of the most difficult problems that we've faced since the advent of nuclear weapons, is the willingness of countries or individuals like Putin to threaten their use. I was reading, we were just talking beforehand, I was reading the transcript of his speech from this morning, and it was interesting. He never actually mentions the word nuclear weapons. He only talks about special capabilities, which, that was deliberate. We all know what he's talking about. there are a number of ways that there's a couple of things to look at this. One is that we, the United States, and through our nuclear umbrella with our allies, have a very significant deterrent capability. Where, we hope that it never comes to this, but the idea that he would just simply be able to drop a nuclear weapon and then think that it was all done with would be wishful thinking of the worst kind. And I think Putin is smart enough to know that. And I also think he has people around him who recognize what that would mean. It was also interesting when he was in Shanghai, or when he was in Samarkand for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, where he had to specifically respond to unspoken criticisms from the Chinese and the Indians. And, I don't have any special knowledge of this, but I can only imagine that both the Chinese and the Indians are telling him, don't even think of it. From my point of view, well, there's a lot of reasons why his invasion was a mistake, but he probably would have been far better off just threatening than actually invading. He probably could have accomplished a lot more of his goals by doing that. And I think there's kind of a little bit of that going on right now. So that's kind of a long-winded. The shorter answer that I would say in dealing with countries like that, there's actually 2 points of it. One is deterrence, is having the capability to say that there's no way that you can do this with impunity. The second part of it actually is diplomacy, and that is to work on new protocols, arms control agreements, things like we did during the Cold War with the Soviets, which was to have a hotline to make sure that there aren't mistakes. If you're looking at some of the things that we've done since the start of this war, we've been very careful about the nature of the exercises that we have done so that there's no thought that we are escalating on this. We've had a good structure between us and the Soviets. We don't have that with the Chinese, and we certainly need to look at doing more of this with North Korea, as much as we don't want to acknowledge that they have them. I mean, it's kind of hard to ignore, and we need to push the Indians and the Pakistanis, for example, to build those kind of safeguards into their relationship as well. So it's both a deterrent side and a diplomacy side to it.
Here. You mentioned the protests in the streets, which would seem to me to be the quickest way to end this thing. Is there any possibility that that will ever happen, or is that just the quickest way to jail?
It's a quick way to jail in Russia, especially since they are also arresting people who leave the front lines in Ukraine, as well as those who do not report when they're called up for military service. And so they're increasing their draconian measures to arrest people who aren't adherent to the government's approach to this war in Ukraine. And so I would say that there's always the possibility and hope at times that those protests will emerge, that you will have this response from civil society that would end up toppling the government, and you will have a democratic system in Russia. And I think that's been a long-term fantasy that's existed. But I think it's still helpful that you have an active, to a degree, Russian civil society that's getting out there to protest. I will also note that while we're paying attention to these protests, because in the West, one of the ways we understand resistance is when people are out there in the streets, but there have been acts of resistance across Russia before these protests and after the larger protests that came in March, early March. So some of the activity of resistance that's happening is burning conscription sites across the country. And that's not receiving attention. It's people who are in their towns holding up signs talking about the war. So it's these daily acts of resistance that's taking place across Russia. And if there are ways that we could support that and communicate to civil society, I think that is something that Europe should explore, the United States government should explore, as well as working with Russian diaspora groups in Europe, in the United States, to try to convey messages about what's really taking place in Ukraine to help bring further awareness and cut through a lot of the propaganda that the Russian government is executing.
So you had mentioned earlier that you thought the war in Ukraine would be a long slog. So my question is twofold. One, Putin has said multiple times that he feels it is a proxy war between Russia and the West. And one, do you agree with that? And the second is, assuming the West is part of it, what terms would you think would be acceptable for Putin for ending the war? And Ukraine, what terms would be acceptable to Ukraine? And then if it is a proxy war, the West. How do we find these?
Well, it's not, we didn't come into it as a proxy war, right? So we are supporting Ukrainian efforts to defend themselves against the very brutal invasion. Russia, it's interesting again, in today's speech and in earlier speeches that Putin has made, he has made it sound like, you know, the West was flooding weapons into Ukraine before the war started. This is why they had to react. If you kind of follow the news in this country at all, you know that wasn't true. That was a large part of it. We had some serious domestic debate about it. There was concern about doing exactly this kind of provocation. Ukrainian government was actually quite vociferous before all this happened, that they wanted Western weapons and support, and they weren't getting them. So, I mean, just on a factual basis, you know, saying that we're there fighting a proxy war, yeah, it fits his internal propaganda, but it doesn't fit the facts. Now, what we are, I mean, to put the other side of it, we're learning an awful lot about the capabilities of the Russian military and the lack of capabilities. We're learning a lot about how their weapons work and don't work. Learning a lot about how Western weapons operate against Russian targets. But we're also learning that the Ukrainians are incredibly inventive on adapting those weapons. You know, when they sank the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, those were homemade cruise missiles out of Ukraine. So, I mean, it's not like we're going, well, we're completely not paying attention here. I mean, we are learning a lot from that. In terms of what it takes, you know, President Zelensky has been quite clear that, you know, talks with Russia are not really in the offing. I mean, Russia's got to pull back. And I would, you know, from my perspective, I would say that if you were to follow some of the people who say, well, we need to have a ceasefire in place right now, all that would do is give the Russians the opportunity to rearm, dig in, and mobilize, and take time to train troops that are not well trained at the moment. So continue, and you know, as hard as it is to say, let this war continue, I think the ultimate, if you really want to have a stable peace, that pushing the Russians as far out of Ukraine as you can is the answer. That becomes a much more difficult piece. And that's why I said this is going to be a longer war. I can see getting to the point where we reach a stalemate, where it becomes much more like a frozen conflict, where the cost of reclaiming Ukraine or reclaiming Crimea or that last bit of territory becomes exponentially higher than the already deep cost that Ukrainians are paying. But you know, it's all. I just one more point on what Heather said. We always have to bear in mind that while we are supporting Ukraine in this, essentially most of the decisions are going to have to come from the Ukrainians themselves about what price they want to bear on this.
Yeah, I would just add that it's that type of rhetoric about proxy war feeds into what Putin has been doing for years and years of constructing the West and the United States as this boogeyman to help legitimize his regime and say, oh, you need protection. We are this big, strong country, and outward projection within the international system about how big and powerful they are. The other aspect of the escalation that's taken place that feeds into negotiations is that some Russia experts in the United States are saying that this spectacle of the partial mobilization, as well as this rhetoric about escalating the use of weapons on the Russian side, is to try to scare the West to force Ukraine to the negotiation table. And so that's another aspect you could think of, that Russia more than likely will not use nuclear weapons, but constantly bringing it up is a way of saying, hey, West, we're finally going to break this unity that the ambassador was talking about between the Europeans and the United States and other countries who are supporting Ukraine during this conflict and criticizing Russia openly in the General Assembly through votes. And so that feeds into part of this escalated rhetoric that you constantly see from the Russians, is to see whether that the West will push Ukraine to the negotiation table. But as the United States and others have noted, in Europe, that the West is not going to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine and leave the Ukrainians out. This is a war of Russia attacking Ukraine, so Ukrainians need to determine the course of their future and have that right.
Here. Okay, I was gonna ask you to speculate, how the war ends. And, also, will Putin stay in power? And if he is replaced, will it be with someone who's more or less belligerent than Putin?
Well, you get that one.
I think in terms of how the war ends, the way that Russia is operating militarily, the protests against mobilization, the inability to, as part of the mobilization, there's the assumption that, oh, when we notify you that you should come, that you're going to show up. And that hasn't happened in this war on the Russian side. So that's something to pay attention to. The other is that they haven't been providing the funds that they talked about as part of the mobilization. So there's no incentive for people to fight, even on a patriotic side, to advance their government. And just the idea of Russian is the Russian nation and their imperial desires. So the way I see this war playing out is that the West, European countries, the US, Canada is going to continue to support and arm Ukraine. And they're going to keep fighting. I think they're going to continue to take back territory that the Russians are occupying. And it's going to become a point, even as Russia is trying to do these fake referendums of saying, oh, we want to be part of Russia now, like we did in Crimea, which is inaccurate and is a sham. That's still not going to stop the Ukrainians from trying to seize back their territory. In terms of what's going to happen to Putin, there's some speculation, my team was engaged in this today, that part of the reason that he is doing this is because he's in trouble among his inner circle. And that's the potential that it's becoming pretty close that someone may try to stage a coup or take him out of some other means. And so there's always that aspect to pay attention to and read between the lines, that as Russia seems more chaotic, Putin is going back and forth. At one point, his speech was supposed to occur yesterday evening, and then it occurs early in the morning. Is that type of chaos that's taking shape within the Russian government and that inner circle that leads some to believe that something is going to happen. Not sure when it could happen. Right now, as we're talking and we receive the news alert, or it could happen weeks later, months later. The other fear is that he isn't the most ultra nationalist within his inner circle. There are people who are just saying, go in and take all of Ukraine and escalate this war and use every tool in Russia's toolbox, weapon-wise. And so he's playing between those sides, and those people are pretty powerful. Some of them are tied to the security services. And so there is the possibility that that's where a potential coup could come from, is those ultra nationalists. And then you're looking at a more dangerous situation. Or civil society continues to mobilize, to build up. And this is the optimism that comes from working at the USCPs, in which we focus on civil society and their role to push for more inclusive democratic systems. You can see whether it's a groundswell of the population that then pushes him out. And then will be this tug of war about what type of leader will emerge in the system. And then the third option, which comes from Russian history, is there's a figure in the government who's operating right now to get various factions together to take on Putin. And we don't know who that individual is.
Is there a generational gap in support of Putin right now for example, younger generations are less in support of Putin because they're less inundated by propaganda since they're more exposed to the internet? Or is there a difference?
Yeah, I would say there is a generational divide in terms of how propaganda works in Russia. A lot of the propaganda that's executed happens through TV. And so it's the older generation who are watching TV and absorbing that. And that's where Putin has had support in the past for bringing stabilization after the 1990s, the chaos that pensions and supporting those individuals, that group, demographic group within Russia. The younger generation, you see them leaving the country because they are using VPNs, getting access to the internet. They have most likely traveled in Europe, United States, other parts of the world, and can get outside more of that propaganda bubble. But I wouldn't say it's completely like all young people in Russia don't support Putin. There's still, much like the US, we would assume that younger people will be more democratic and older people will be more Republican. There's still that type of environment where it doesn't adhere to those strict divides, but you do have Russians using VPNs and accessing various social media sites, internet sites to learn about what's going on with their governments doing and conveying that in people to people exchanges and discussions. And then one thing that's lost in this war is that you had mixed families, Russian-Ukrainian families, in which the mother could be Ukrainian, father could be Russian. And so you have this flow back and forth across the border. Businesses, you have that type of dynamic that's been destroyed. And there's been tensions in those families from some reports of the Ukrainian side trying to tell their Russian relatives. It's like, hey, this is not what is being reported on TV, and the challenge of those Russians to understand what's taking place and not being able to accept it. Because if they knew about it, you have to accept it and be made feel obligated to do something. And what do you do in an authoritarian system to respond and challenge your government? That's also an aspect of what's taking place inside Russia.
Here and then.
Thank you. Russia did make a big concession in letting the cereal supplies out of Ukraine. What was behind that decision for Russia to decide to do that? And who were some of the key actors? I know the UN was somewhat involved, but are there other points of where Russia could make some concessions and gain more, let's say, global support?
Well, as you pointed out, one of the key brokers of that agreement was the United Nations. The other key broker was Turkey. And of course, geographically, all this stuff has to go through the Bosphorus to leave the Black Sea. But Turkey also has been playing a very interesting role with Russia. I think you described them earlier as frenemies, where they can work together on some things and then support opposing sides on the other. I mean, the Turks have been one of the major arms suppliers for Ukraine with their armed drones that have really played a key role here. So part of the dynamic was, as the war progressed and exports from Ukraine and Russia were blocked primarily by the Russians, huge outcry around the world because a lot of the developing world in particular is dependent on exports of grain and fertilizers from both countries. And so one of the things that Russia was trying to do was to bolster its own image, saying like, some of what they do defies credulity, like we're not the aggressor here, we're not the bad guys, they're invading another country and bombing it. So they needed to do something to bolster their image on this. The other thing that they needed to do was they needed to earn foreign exchange. They need money. And so this was one way of doing that. And the price of doing that was to allow it out of the Ukrainian ports as well. I don't know, I'm hard pressed. I mean, maybe the Russians could offer energy supplies at lower prices, but that's not a great proposition for them either. I mean, they're certainly not going to do that to Europe. They're already cutting off gas supplies. And outside of energy, grain, and weapons, I'm not sure what the Russians have to offer the rest of the world.
Yeah, I would just say in those type of negotiations, there was a negotiation about prisoner exchanges, and that hasn't been receiving as much attention from news sources in the West. So there is some type of dialogue happening between the Russians and Ukrainians. In this example, the UN and the Turkish government stepped in, but another area in which that type of coalition can play a role is the mines that Russia has dropped in the Black Sea that are floated all over the place. And so even as you're trying to get ships out, that's still the possibility of other countries being susceptible to dealing with those mines. So that could also be an area of negotiation of the removal of those mines to allow greater ship traffic to happen in the Black Sea without concerns that they'll blow up. And so I think that would be another opportunity to have these type of low-level negotiations to hopefully build up to the broader and most important negotiations of finding a way to stop this conflict that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So in the context of this conflict, what does energy independence provide from your own?
There is no such thing as, well, unless they can convert to entirely green technologies that are fully sustainable. It's hard to see that. What it actually means is greater diversification of their energy supplies. So in the short term, you're seeing postponement of decommissioning of nuclear plants. You're seeing a handful of coal plants either coming back online or not being decommissioned. You're seeing the United States trying to export more liquefied natural gas, but that's limited by the terminals on both sides. Getting more gas from Norway, getting more gas from Algeria, for example, maybe from the Gulf. But the reality for Europe in particular this winter is it's going to be a hard, expensive winter for them because the energy supplies aren't going to be there. And you're already seeing European governments planning to spend some pretty significant amount of money on subsidies for their citizens. I think the Germans just nationalized three gas companies to help control and stabilize the price of gas. I think it'll spur the development of more renewable energy. I think it'll renew the debate about nuclear power. Especially in Germany. I mean, the French, I think something like 40+% of their energy already comes from nuclear. The Germans were in the process of decommissioning most of their plants after Fukushima. And they're already talking about that. I think some people were kind of really upset in Europe about reclassifying nuclear as green energy, renewable energy. So, that whole debate is being very hard fought there. But I think, one of the things that the Europeans tried to do was they actually look at their own experience with France and Germany and right after the Second World War, where they created the European coal community. And the idea was to bind those economies so tightly that Germany and France would never go to war again. And it's worked really well. And that was the founding of the European Union. And I think part of the idea was that if they could bind Russia more tightly economically and primarily through these energy supplies, that the same thing would happen. Well, it's a great idea, but it's kind of depends on Russian willingness to be more integrated. And certainly that has not been the case. And so the Russians have been able to use that as a pretty significant weapon. And they have really counted on that as breaking the will of the Europeans to support Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, and those energy prices are going to be translated to us as well. Our energy prices are going to go up.
I would also add quickly to that question, before moving on to the next one, is that the Europeans are also in a dangerous spot of taking energy from one authoritarian, pulling back and looking at other authoritarian countries to take energy from. Most prominently, they're trying to have gas and oil from Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan just attacked its neighbor and this ongoing conflict that's been going on back and forth for over 30 years. And so Azerbaijan, one, because Russia is in attacking Ukraine, and so is not able to play more of that mediator role it has in the past. That's incentivizing Azerbaijan to go in and treat Armenia however it wants, because no one's going to step in. The other aspect is that the Europeans need this gas, and so they're not going to come down as harshly on Azerbaijan in their act of aggression against their neighbor. And so that's another challenge of what the Europeans are encountering, that it doesn't seem like they're actually learning in real time how to address this issue. They're putting themselves in another situation. And on that side is Azerbaijan, and then they're also dealing with Algeria, and they're like, hey, keep sending more gas. We're going to look the other way on human rights abuses, on not adhering to democratic reforms. And so it's leading to an even worse situation that can get inflame further conflicts in different parts of the world.
Gentleman here. And then to-
Okay, my question is, I see they're going to have this in some sort of bogus referendums in those straightaway eastern provinces within, they have a 3-day lead time on it. I think we know how the outcome of those referendums would be. And I think the ultimate goal is to annex those provinces to Russia, to be a part of Russia, because Russia, of course, considered Ukraine to be a part, to be a part of them ultimately anyway. So my question is, do you think that they will view, the continued push into the eastern provinces as an attack on Russia itself after they've been annexed to Russia?
Yeah, I think that's also part of the escalation that Russia is trying to engage in. Like, oh, the Ukrainians are now attacking Russian territory. And it's like you're occupying another country's territory, and then you're going to say that they're then on Russian soil. The other aspect of this is I don't know how, from an economic standpoint, that Russia is able to absorb those territories, because it also involves supporting the government, the individuals, the pensions, teachers, and so forth, the daily function of government in those territories, and they haven't been that successful. And once something is absorbed, that they're able to elevate the standards of living or help those individuals out in that region. Just look at Crimea and their abuse, particularly directed at the Crimean Tatars, who have been abused for decades by the Russians under the Soviet system and now under Putin's system. And so it's part of that escalation aspect of it. But as long as we keep supporting Ukraine, I don't anticipate that those breakaway republics or territories in Russia, that however Russia wants to define them, are going to be under Russian control that much longer.
I have a question, actually 2 questions. Sure. Okay, so Ukraine becomes more isolated, even though we have a lot of media presence, and even being involved today, I heard so many news about like what's going on in Ukraine, that's randomly, someone in the car, someone in the house. But at the same time, I think that Ukraine becomes isolated because it's not easy to leave the country, and even if you have a permit to leave the country, you still can leave the airport. You have to cross the land border, and also like when I'm asking around, like and talking to so many people that are supporting Ukraine, they are still kind of afraid of entering the country, even do volunteering, in the safe regions of Ukraine. So I was wondering maybe like to bring more research, more information. Is it anyhow possible to have this like 100% protection over some parts of Ukraine where you can like at least like start an airport operating, so it would be easier to do some transportations and like flying to Ukraine and out of Ukraine? Would it be possible to have this kind of like again like missile strikers, I don't know, whatever, some mechanisms that could be, could secure airports. At least one airport or two airports, like in the most like closest to the Poland or Romania as well. And second question is, what would you think that Ukrainians could do to be more understandable and to have like better message? And do you suggest also doing some reforms to be more transparent, to be democratic, or any other suggestions that generally public is expecting from us to like to be more understandable by the world?
Take the first one, you do the second. So on the first question, one of the problems is that the Russians.
We need to hear it.
So everybody hears the question?
Maybe just very.
So the first question was, is it possible to set up safe zones, particularly in Western Ukraine, that would allow, say, airport operations, that allow people to go in and out of the country more easily, safely? And I think you used the term 100%. And then the second question, what could Ukrainians do to reach out more to the West? Things in terms of democratic reforms and others to help tie Ukraine more closely to the West, if I understand your question correctly. So in the first question, the Russians still have the capability with standoff weapons, both air-launched and ground-launched missiles, as they've demonstrated throughout the course of the war, that they can launch missiles from inside Russian territory to strike inside, the furthest reaches of Ukraine. There are defensive systems that you can put into place, but they have real drawbacks. So, for example, there are American-made and Israeli-made anti-missile systems, the Patriot PAC-3, and then there's an Israeli derivative of that called the Iron Dome, that are pretty effective, but not 100% effective. And so your missiles can still get through. It's pretty difficult. There's also a thing called a phalanx, which is essentially, it's almost out of a science fiction movie, where you basically have these gigantic machine guns, and they just put tons of metal up into the air. So they can knock down everything from rockets to mortars to artillery shells. The problem is that what goes up comes down. So you're firing a whole bunch of stuff over Ukrainian territory that's going to knock out one rocket, but then you're going to have a whole bunch of these shells are going to be falling down on top of Ukrainian civilians. So unless you're doing it in an area where you know that that's not going to happen, it's actually more dangerous than trying to stop it itself. And then there has been talk, although I am a little bit skeptical about Russian deployment of hypersonic missiles, things that are way above Mach 5, that you just don't have the reaction time to stop it. I'm not, the Russians have claimed to develop it. Our Department of Defense has also hyped it up. Every report that I've seen, it's been a failure, but the threat could still be real. So you can take steps, but I don't think with long range weaponry being what it is, you're not going to make it 100% secure.
Yeah, I would say for the second question, this is one of the topics that we're discussing with our local partner in Ukraine that we're helping to fund for joint projects. They want to do an information campaign to clarify messaging. And so from engaging with them, and one of the things that I've learned is the importance of civil society and civil society engagement to maintain that type of support within European countries and the United States. And there are plenty of organizations both in Europe and the United States that will be interested in fostering that type of dialogue. And what can happen from those dialogues is the release of public statements, social media events, social media messaging to convey that there is that people-to-people ties support, and that can maintain that there's like the American public, German public, French public's continued pressure on their governments to support Ukraine and keep that message in. So Ukraine isn't isolated, and to help address your first question about increasing the security and the possibility of enabling Ukrainians to have their airport open, to have more safety in other parts of the country. The other aspect is USIP helped co-sponsor a conference this past summer with representatives of the Ukrainian civil society. And as a result of that conference, it's called the Salzburg Statement, and it was a conference with the Salzburg Global Seminar in Austria. And what that statement was developed by representatives of Ukrainian civil society. So having broadcast that type of message, those type of programs, what Ukrainian civil society is doing, in particular of trying to foster a more democratic system within Ukraine. Because I think we received questions on the radio last week about corruption, and that's circulated among people. It's like, oh, Ukraine is this corrupt country. So it's having that ability to have ready responses to counter that people in their everyday is like, why when Americans hear that, they're like, no, that's not accurate. What we've noticed on civil society engagement, that they're actually fighting for greater independent media, that they're addressing issues of corruption, and that they're moving towards greater European integration. So having that type of messaging, especially coming from civil society, would be so useful.
Here and there. Early on, there was a large migration of people out of Ukraine into Eastern Europe countries. And we don't hear a lot about how that has disrupted the society on the ground in Ukraine and how much that has impacted the support level of Eastern European countries that are absorbed. Maybe they haven't details about that large number of people that we created across the border that should.
Yeah, I would note that as you hear that the U.S. government is providing all this aid to Ukraine, it's not just in weapons, it's that humanitarian assistance that's also going to Ukraine to not only deal with people who have left the country and now are refugees in other European countries and to a lesser degree the United States, but also to address the internally displaced population of Ukraine, which is pretty significant. That started after 2014 and has continued and accelerated since Russia escalated the war earlier this year. And so that type of assistance that the U.S. government, European partners are provided is helping to address some of those, what you expect, strains on various governments who are absorbing a lot of Ukrainians. But from what we have heard at USIP, even though there are tensions, which is to be expected in any situation, this isn't different from the way other countries are dealing with refugees. In the sense of it's going to be tensions between the host community and the refugees. What's happening is that these governments are allowing Ukrainians to have work permits to get to work. They're helping them with housing, with schooling for young people, because a lot of these individuals are women with children in these situations. So there is support provided by the Polish government, by the German government, by the US, because there are mechanisms in place to help provide that support for refugees who are in country and also internally displaced people. There are also multilateral big institutions, organizations that are helping, like the Red Cross, who are really helping Ukraine deal with the internally displaced people by providing housing and helping the people who are in the East settle in the West. Determining how long that will be, because you're also talking now, having discussions about what reconstruction of Ukraine looks like as well.
I have a couple questions. I think one, kind of getting back to the energy comment, when we talked about Europe's, lack of energy during this time, and what their substitutability is or optionality to procure energy from the trading one authoritarian energy for another. One, what optionality do you see that they have for other energy sources from a trading perspective? Maybe in a non-authoritarian context, that's the way it fights. And then the second question I would have would be, you kind of you talked a little bit about sort of Russia's ability or inability to sort of absorb any of these territories if they take over, talk about tensions and things of that nature. I think if you will, of the superior perspective, I'm sort of framing right now before and after, and we talked about the product, it's a much more sort of longer standing issue, but just kind of your perspective on sort of quality of life for Finn as a region, pre and post occupation.
The energy?
Yeah.
I'll do the energy. Okay. I don't see a lot of short-term options for the Europeans. I think they really don't have much choice but to deal with Azerbaijan and Algeria and potentially some of the Gulf states as well. We are working to expand our exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe, but you know, there's only so much capacity that's in place right now, both in terms of the terminals and the shipping requirements, and you know, you're not going to build that overnight. Certainly, it would be a great outlet for American natural gas and to have that as a steady customer, and I think you'll see that grow. But the short term, they're going to have to. They will be accepting these rather unpleasant compromises of dealing with these authoritarian regimes. And then their long-term option is to expand to countries like the United States, Canada. I mean, you know, geopolitics kind of determines where this energy is coming from. And then their other option is to go even more for renewables. And that may include, if you classify nuclear as a renewable, that certainly is an option. As a little bit of an aside, I was just reading The Economist about all this. There's a whole bunch of work going on about smaller nuclear plants. Particularly, I think the French are working on, as well as some American companies that would be much smaller and much quicker and much less expensive than what we currently use. Although the problem of waste is not going to go away, and then all of the problems with potential proliferation that go along with that. No, this is a situation where there are no good options for the Europeans. I mean, we're a little bit insulated from that, but we're not entirely insulated from it. So, you know, the long run, I guess one could say the long run is to push to make these regimes a lot less authoritarian. But we've seen how successful we've been in the short term trying to force that kind of change on other countries. And we have not been terribly successful.
Yeah, I would say with Crimea, it's been a very difficult situation. Their quality of life hasn't improved at all. And you see this situation that for us to have, when we did our civil society conference over the summer, we wanted representatives from Crimea, and it was just so difficult for them to access individuals in Crimea and then to have them leave the area to come to this conference to engage on civil society. So that's another aspect of what's happening is the way Russia is clamping down on democratic aspects of Crimea that existed previously that don't exist anymore because of their occupation of the peninsula. And that's similar to what was taking place in eastern Ukraine under Russian occupation, that they start handing out Russian passports, start setting up security checkpoints, and limiting the ability for people to go back and forth for business, for engaging with friends and family. And it's quite unfortunate that Russia just can't let go of this territory and their imperial ambitions that have existed from the Tsarist period, the Soviet Union to now, because it's limiting the ability for individuals, particularly Ukrainians who are in Crimea, to exercise their rights, their basic human rights, and to fight for more democratic principles and freedom.
Quick question. This week at Nova, there was a bit of talk about war crimes. And we know how long it takes to get any movement on that, but do you think that there might be some, say, action to begin early on in the conflict, war crime investigations or prosecutions?
No, it's not too early, and it's actually already begun in some ways. I mean, certainly the Ukrainian government has been sending investigators in as soon as they liberate territory, and we've seen some pretty horrific reports about mass murder, torture, and whatnot. The question is, how do you hold people accountable? And that's the difficult thing. So you can look at, there are some structures. I mean, there is the International Criminal Court, but Russia is not a member of the International Criminal Court and doesn't recognize its jurisdiction. So it's extremely unlikely that they would ever turn any of their generals, people in command, or even low-level soldiers over to the International Criminal Court or to an ad hoc tribunal, which would have to be established by the Security Council, which of course Russia would veto. That still doesn't prevent the International Criminal Court from opening an investigation. They can do that at the request of a member state, which in this case would be Ukraine. They could ask them to at least investigate, although they would be able to prosecute. There is the principle of universal jurisdiction. So many countries, including the United States and including most European countries, hold that certain things are universal crimes against humanity. And it doesn't matter where they occur. If the alleged perpetrator is in your custody, in your territory, you can arrest them and try them for that. So again, you would have to have somebody in the territory of one of these countries get arrested or be somewhere else and get extradited over. So I mean, I'm not giving you a lot of really hopeful things here because the mechanisms just simply, we don't have a global sheriff's marshal's department to go out and arrest people to hand them over. Other alternatives, there have been a few cases where Ukraine has captured Russians. They've had a couple of trials, generally very low level people for some of the crimes that they've committed. But you're not getting the upper echelon of people who are most responsible for that. If there were a change of government in Russia, I could foresee potentially trials there, but I don't see the Russians actually handing them over to somebody else to do that. They would want to do it themselves. Yeah, and those are kind of where we stand right now. I mean, there are still the sanctions, economic sanctions, but those always seem like a pretty weak response to this. We don't have the real mechanisms to do that. And I mean, and in fairness, I have to point out that the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court either, even though it was our idea.
I will be slightly more optimistic and plug the U.S. Institute of Peace because we've been holding a series of events on this question of accountability. Most recently, yesterday, we hosted the Ukrainian prosecutor general who's overseeing the collection of this evidence about war crimes. And so that was a discussion about whether what Russia has executed in Ukraine amounts to genocide. So that was the conversation yesterday. And it follows on previous events we have held with Karim Khan of the International Criminal Court to have these discussions around accountability, featuring the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States and other individuals from the Ukrainian government and other experts within the field of accountability. And so we'll continue to do that work and engage with the Ukrainian government, provided expertise from European partners and other parts of the world that USIP operates in and has awareness of successful cases of holding individuals accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And then we're also looking to build up our own capacity to do this work by engaging the U.S. government. And so as the ambassador noted, the U.S. doesn't have a great history of engaging with the International Criminal Court, but we have noticed that there are some inroads being made with Congress and having a broader discussion about this and more open discussion about whether, I forget what act it is that limits the accountability for U.S. servicemen. Some members.
The American Service Members Protection Act,
Yeah.
the SPC, I know that one really well.
And so there's been some members of Congress who are open to modifying that regarding accountability. And so we're trying to maintain that momentum and keep it, because what this war is opening up as broader discussions about accountability and what the US can do. And we're trying to really push that forward at the US Institute of Peace.
Other than obviously, nuclear action by Russia, how high of a cost is Europe willing to take on or allow globally before they put boots on the ground in Ukraine or other areas in Europe? For instance, like, you had mentioned famine, developing countries, wars in Azerbaijan. How much of a cost is Europe willing to incur before they put troops into Ukraine?
Take the first stab, and then you can come in with another one. I would be very surprised to see European troops in Ukraine, for a variety of reasons. One is that it's, even though the Europeans have some significant military capabilities, the reality is that that Europeans can't operate without NATO. NATO doesn't operate without the United States. And so if you're putting European troops on the ground, I mean, individual European nations aren't going to do it. France isn't going to do it. The British aren't going to do it. Germany is certainly not going to do it. So it would essentially take the Russians going all the way through Ukraine and into NATO territory, I think, for that to happen. And that is an escalation that we all really devoutly hope does not happen. It does appear from the statements that are coming out of Europe and the actions that they're taking, that they're right now prepared to take a pretty substantial economic hit to support Ukraine. And that's what Vladimir Putin and his allies are counting on, is that that's going to break. And so, and I think, you kind of look at it from a couple of perspectives. One, Ukraine is paying a very high price, and they are taking some really significant casualties in addition to all of the material damage that's being done. But they're also holding their own and are able to roll back a lot of these Russian advances. And the best thing that we can do right now is to continue to support, even I think to increase that material support to Ukraine, to give them the advantages that they need to fight the Russians. The second thing that we need to do is try to figure out some way to get Russia out, diplomatically and politically. I mean, there oftentimes people make it as a dichotomy between war and diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't stop because a war is going on. You still need to explore that. And if I can put in a plug for USIP as well, this is where institutes like USIP really come in handy, because they can reach out much easier to civil society within Russia than, say, the United States government can. If the United States government, if the US Embassy or one of the other branches of the government reaches out to civilians inside of Russia, the Russians that do that are immediately American stooges and CIA agents, and they're lucky if they end up in jail. USIP does it, they can do track 2 diplomacy, where they can bring in folks from both Ukrainian civilians and Russian civilians, and perhaps find ways to start exploring. And it always seems like that's a really difficult, it is a very difficult thing to do, but we've seen that kind of success in the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and elsewhere. So having an institute like this to help us explore that, to get things to the stage where eventually then you could have government-to-government peace talks at the same time. But I think with Russia right now, with Vladimir Putin, the only thing to get them to that point where they're even think about talking is you've got to keep that military pressure on, and you've got to keep that material support, and do not hand the Russians the propaganda victory of putting non-Ukrainian troops into Ukraine. I mean, you already see that with a handful of volunteers and foreigners who've come in. They've really kind of beef that up as some gigantic mercenary army from the West, our version of their little green men. Let's not hand them that victory. Let's not hand them the propaganda, but we didn't have to, certainly not now.
Send it off.
Thank you.
We've got time for one last question, somebody who's not asked a question. Just to.
Okay, I have sort of a two-part question. The first is there any chance or situation where the US would stop supporting Ukraine? And the second part of that question is, what do you think, Putin's what is he actually trying to accomplish? Is it imperialism for the sake of imperialism, or is there something more to that?
I'll take a stab at the first one, and I will try very hard to be nonpartisan on this. And I think it would require a change in administration and a change in public opinion to the point where, okay, I'm going to make a statement here where it's like, we all love to say that freedom ain't free. Well, I think we are supporting freedom in Ukraine, and we need to put our money where our mouth is. If we decide that it's too high a price to pay, and we get an administration that reflects that, then I think you would see a change on that. But having said that, I do think that the vast majority of Americans of all political stripes strongly support Ukraine's efforts. So I don't, absent a massive seismic shift, I don't see us stopping that support.
Yeah, and I think Russian justifications for the war, they've gone through a number of them, from trying to stop the supposed Nazi regime in Kiev to NATO expansion. It's a security threat to Russia. But I think at the core of it is imperialism. Like Russians don't know who they are if they're not dominating others and have this influence on their neighbors. It goes back hundreds of years. And so they never had a lengthy time to explore their own national identity when it's not tied to an empire. You went from the Tsar's empire to the Soviet Union, in which Russia was the critical linchpin there, to break down and how Russia operated during the 1990s. Then Putin comes back and does successive waves of wars and interventions in nearby regions near its border. And so I think at the core of it is this imperial mindset. And that's going to take a long time to fix. And that's why it's so critical to engage Russian civil society, because that's how you start stopping that type of mentality and challenge a lot of this toxic nationalism, ultranationalism that exists in Russia, because it exists on multiple levels. Even opposition forces who may be opposed to Putin still support Russia's imperial ambitions. And so there's no guarantee that say, hey, this person has criticized Putin, pointed out the corruption, but it doesn't mean that they would have a different course of action in Ukraine. So that's something to keep in mind, that the core of it is this imperial desire of domination. And the Russian Federation itself is still an empire. You have other parts of the Russian Federation in which there's like, oh, they could demonstrate their own foreign policy and domestic policy, but that's not the case. Tatarstan, Chechnya, that's not the case at all for those regions.